This is my socials final, and I chose to make a CPR blueprint for my artifact. These are all the categories I will be going over, plus a timeline and references. First, the geography of Canada and its connections to the CPR. Canadian land had a large impact on the CPR route because it differed so much region to region with rivers, mountains, and lakes. Mountain passes were hard to get through, which would just mean more money to build a bridge or something to get around it. Canadian weather was another factor, as lots of times the weather was quite unpredictable and slowed progress of building the CPR. Overall, since Canada is such a large place, putting a transcontinental railway was quite a big task, but it was definitely worth it in the end, with all the supplies being brought over. Next, the Industrial Revolution. Railways were very important to the Industrial Revolution because once they had steam engines, they were able to carry more materials and people that would eventually lead to industrialize even more. Another part is the influence, because seeing the way that the British and the Americans had used the Industrial Revolution inspired Canadian thought to build that railway and industrialize later on. Another part are the materials that were used in the Industrial Revolution. Different materials would arrive through the revolution, and you can see some of the materials that were used for trains on my blueprint, mostly steel and iron. Fur trade and imperialism. The big impact of the fur trade was expansion. The fur trade expanded borders and land, which led to the need for industrialization for travel and transport around the larger borders. Supply and demand also led to the need for trains because it would be easier for the fur trade to trade furs and supplies with a faster way of doing it, which they did not have at the time. Another part are the loyalties to Britain that Canada had because they needed to fight in wars for Britain, which means they needed goods transported fast. The Canadian Confederacy and independence were also a factor. Canadian Confederation. One of the 72 resolutions decided in the Quebec Conference was that they wanted to have a railway, specifically from Quebec to the Maritimes, but having the CPR would be even more helpful in the future. Most of the leaders of Confederation and the surrounding peoples wanted to unite Canada with all its provinces, but to do that, BC required a transcontinental railway, which would be the CPR later on. American Revolution. Loyalists. Many loyalists would leave the U.S. to stay in Canada because the U.S. had gained independence. This grew the population significantly and required new and more efficient technology to keep demand low and supply high. Manifest Destiny. After receiving independence, American glory would be at an all-time high, prompting the thoughts of invasion, which put fear in the surrounding colonies. This would lead to certain places, specifically Canada and Nova Scotia, to wanting more protection from the government. Another part is inspiration. People in the Canadian colonies might have seen that the Americans had gained such freedom and independence and the opportunities that had come with it, and might have wanted that in Canada. The industrial gains of America would also be noticed and possibly could inspire some builders and engineers from Canada to want some of their own. Historical look at BC. First Nations. The CPR was built on First Nations land through a series of treaties. They were promised compensation for building on their land, such as tools and money and food. These treaties enabled the CPR to be built on BC soil. Chinese workers. Many Chinese workers would be brought over by the gold rush, looking for money to send back home to their families. When the CPR building begins in BC, they see an opportunity and take it, even though they're being paid less than white workers. On the topic of Chinese workers, my great-great-grandfather came to Canada to work on the railway in 1911, aiding the expansion of the CPR. The conditions were said to be around the same as the original construction, with less pay and quite harsh conditions. His main aim of coming to Canada to work on the railway was to send money back to his family in Hong Kong. His documents coming to Canada are on the right. Building through BC. Building in BC was a tough job, mainly getting through the mountains. Bridges such as the Stony Creek Bridge were built to accommodate. Chinese workers and other workers were put through harsh conditions to finish, but eventually the last spike was down. This is my timeline for the CPR railway. It begins with BC entering Confederation with a request of a railway and ends with the CPR track expansion ending. These are my references. Thank you for watching my presentation.